All right, we are here today with Ray Cronise, a passionate innovator, disruptor, and scientist. Ray began his career at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center, where he worked for 15 years in both material science and biophysics. Ray then went on to co-found Zero G, a company that produces weightlessness and approximates space flight conditions for the purposes of both cinema and entertainment. Ray was then written about in Tim Ferriss's book, The 4-Hour Body. In that book, Tim Ferriss wrote about Ray's work with cold stress therapy as a tool for fat loss. And Ray then went on to write a paper about that called The Metabolic Winter Hypothesis, and it is a fascinating paper. Last but not least, Ray is the man behind the amazing weight loss transformation of Penn Jillette, from the comedy duo Penn and Teller. Ray guided Penn as he lost more than 100 pounds using a plant-based diet. So thanks so much for being here today with us, Ray. We really appreciate your time.
Thanks. I wish I was down there in Costa Rica.
All right, we'll get you down here real soon. No question.
Yeah. Hi,
right,
Robbie.
Good to have you with us.
So Ray, you have a really non-traditional background, which I actually really admire. So can you give us both your background and your personal story and tell us how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, by complete accident and dumb luck, I think. So, so I studied chemistry in undergraduate and graduate school, and my love and passion was space and space flight. And so my business partners and I was at NASA, but our dream was to open up private space. So we did those things that you talked about to open up private space. We sent the first 8 private passengers to space station, and Mir, with a company called Space Adventures, we launched the X Prize, which Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and everybody was sort of originally competing in. Burt Rutan actually won it, but the people that came in, second, third, and fourth all went on to develop all these great commercial rockets. So, looking back, 30 years later, it's amazing to see all of this real private competition. So, but during all that time, I was entrepreneurial, and I gained what ended up being around 85 pounds. So by the time I was in my mid 40s, and I was sort of doing what I used to call Ray 3.0, which was, after my government career and after my sort of academic career, after my entrepreneurial phase, I was sick and overweight like a lot of people. And part of it was, that creeping up of fasting blood glucose and, the postprandial glucose spikes after, high dietary carbohydrate meals. And, I was, type 2 diabetic or on my way in there. And so the real wake up sign for me was I was literally, passing out after meals. I would just get reactive hypoglycemia to the best of my knowledge. That's what it was. And so I did what everybody said, I lost weight. And that's what Tim's talking about in that book. So from October 27th through December 8th, I lost 30 or 40, the last 30 or 40 pounds. And, everybody says you're going to get better. You lose weight, you're going to get better. Right. And I actually got worse. My cholesterol was higher. I was using a program called Body for Life. Maybe somebody's heard of it. So I wasn't plant-based at all. And so for that year, I actually lived with just really bad situations. And, my doctor was telling me you need to, cut down on carbs and, all the normal language everybody's saying. And then it wasn't until at TEDMed in October 2009 that I was at a reception with Dean and Ann Ornish. And, I told Dean what was going on. And he said, hey, look, why don't you try, what are you eating now? And really I was down to fish. I was salmon, eggs, and cottage cheese, because I was having cottage cheese and yogurt, right? So that was literally the only things. I wasn't really even eating cheese outside of some cottage cheese. So it wasn't like I was pounding pizzas or, eating steaks or ribeyes or any of that stuff. That was the only thing left. So he said, why don't you just get rid of those and see what happens? And so I started November 23rd, 2009. It was the week before Thanksgiving. And I said, I'm doing plant-based for the next year. Done, over. I'm just going to go full and just see. And if my fingernails are falling out and, I'm starting to, photosynthesize, I'll figure that out after the fact, but I'm going to do this 100%. Cause I hate when people give you advice and you take half of it and then complain that it doesn't work. And I hate when I give advice and people are kind of like picking and choosing. So I went out and I bought Furman's book and McDougall's and Bernard's and everybody's book. And all I can say is the first 10 months sucked. 2 months. I didn't know what I was doing, but the truth is I only took 3 ingredients out of my diet. It was all invented. but I wasn't used to eating the way we now eat. So fast forward, within 45 to 60 days, my glucose was fine. My A1C normalized. My fasting glucose was good. And I was eating more starches and fruits and stuff than I was eating before. I wasn't having any of the sleeping thing. I lost a little bit more weight. So that made me sort of dig in. And then at the same time, about that time, all of that stuff you talked about with Tim Ferriss and the cold came out, and people started challenging me that, did I really lose my weight? Does the cold really work? Whatever. And so I ended up building the metabolic lab that's behind me, because I really wanted to test things. And once that got started, I was actually able, since my kitchen is, right in front of me, I was able to actually start making meals. And I would literally come out here, make meals, lay on that bed in the nutritional hood, doing metabolism measurements, and watch the great courses and other kinds of things, so I could sort of catch up on all this physiology and a lot of things that I hadn't learned yet, started educating. That's about a 6 or 7 year process. And what I found is that, there were a lot of these issues that had been solved a long time ago, as you guys have both know as well. And that my concept of food, this idea of protein, carbs, and fat, wasn't the best way to organize food. People really believe that there's a such thing as a protein or a carb or a fat in food. And the truth is, if those words were completely erased from our discussion of food, we'd actually do a lot better at managing our diet. They cause people to make poor decisions. You guys deal with it if I say sugar. If I say sugar, both of you have that same reaction. You get the hairs on the back of your neck, because it's like, why are you saying sugar? Because that it prejudices the conversation and people aren't thinking about it in its real way. Well, I'm saying protein is just as prejudiced, and so is fat. And so what happens is that, as I started looking at this in another paper we wrote called Oxidative Priority, it demonstrates how the body processes food, which are usually a mixture of these kinds of things. And it turns out that many of these things are calorically similar, but they're not metabolically similar. So what we would say in science is they're isocaloric, but they're not isometabolic. And this is what causes I think a great deal of the conflict that we see, where people are constantly arguing about sugar versus oil. They're different sides of the same coin. One sees a president and the other one sees a monument or whatever, but they're looking at the same coin. So anyway, that's where I am today. I don't have a problem. I've continued to work with a collaborator who's the director of type 2 diabetes for NIH, and we're looking at how we can do potentially some clinical trials to see how all this plays out. But the idea is, I really want to dig deeper. So I come at this really with an open mind. Whatever the solution is, that's what I just want to find it.
Yeah, your story is amazing, and your personal success and maintaining it is awesome. Very inspiring. So you love the history of nutrition. Can you give our audience a fun fact related to diabetes that they might not know?
Yeah. So thanks for asking. I mean, you guys, we've talked about this before, and so yeah, this is actually really interesting. So I want to start with that idea of protein. I want to real quickly say, for those people, what is a protein? A protein, every cell in your body has tens of thousands of proteins, plural, in it. So proteins are sort of the building block of life, enzymes, hormone, insulin is a protein, and that's what we're going to talk about. But the idea of these things are just like the 26 letters of the alphabet. There's 20 amino acids that are rearranged in a sequence, and that sequence of materials has a certain biological function, just like letters become words and words become sentences, sentences become paragraphs. And that's basically your book of life. This is how your genes, your 25,000 genes or so, encode these different proteins. So genes, DNA, is sort of a protein printing press. So you don't get protein from diet. You get amino acids from diet, but your body is constantly turning over amino acids and proteins, like insulin that we talk about, and it breaks them apart and it conserves and it reuses but the idea that somehow you need something in food other than these 9 essential amino acids, so 9 of those, like buying the vowel on Jeopardy, 9 of them your body can't do it. In fact, no animal makes them. No animal makes the essential amino acids. The idea that you have to eat meat or flesh or anything to get those is sort of ludicrous. I mean, we look at the largest mammals, 5 rhinoceros, 2 elephants, a giraffe, a hippopotamus, and a guard. None of them eat meat, and they're pretty muscular. So bringing that back to this little history thing is this story of insulin is actually pretty neat because what's kind of interesting, and actually this is the book. I have a historic book collection. This is a book by Schaefer, and E.A. Schaefer is the father of endocrinology. And I found this book, I found this really interesting because what he talks about in here, and I'm gonna read this to you guys and I assume most people know a little bit about, because we're talking to people that have diabetes, but he says the nature of the pancreatic autocoid, the result of pancreatic expiration and pancreas grafting can, as we have seen, be best explained by exposing that the islet tissues produces an autocoid, which passes into the blood and affects carbohydrate metabolism and carbohydrate storage in such a manner that there's no undue accumulation of glucose in the blood. Provisionally, it will be convenient to refer to this hypothetical autocoid as insulin. It must, however, be stated that it has yet to be determined whether the active substance is present as such in the pancreas or whether it exists there as a proinsulin, which becomes elsewhere converted into the active autocoid. Now, just fast forwarding a little bit, there is something called proinsulin that's linked together, and it does become an active form of insulin. But this was written in 1916, which is 5 years before Banting discovered insulin, which I think is pretty fascinating. He came up with the idea that it had to exist before it was actually discovered. And that's kind of an interesting thing. So this is this idea that innovation often is having confidence in nonsense. Somebody could say, oh, you can't prove that. Where's your clinical trials? Where's your proof? Where's your data? No, he just sort of made it up. He said, this fits the pattern of what we see. And once he spotted it and put the spotlight on it, it was really interesting that later Banting discovered that. Banting gets the 1921 or 1923 Nobel Prize for discovering insulin. And then fast forwarding, you remember I talked about these proteins being sequences? Well, a guy by the name of Fred Sanger, who I actually got to meet back when I was doing protein chemistry at NASA, Fred Sanger got the 1958 Nobel Prize for the first person to create one of those, to take a protein and get one of those amino acid sequences. And what was the protein he synthesized? He sequenced first? Insulin. So I think it's kind of an interesting poetic kind of thing that we deal with protein as a concept with food, and it's particular in the plant-based community. And yet at the same time, it's sort of ironic, or I shouldn't say ironic, it's sort of interesting that at the same time, when we compare this to diabetes and insulin, that people really don't know what proteins are. And I'm talking about people that have graduated from medical school. I'm talking about me when I was doing protein synthesis work and literally synthesizing and doing protein crystal structure. I didn't know what a protein was. And I mean that not in a textbook sense. I mean it in a conceptual sense. And yet these guys, when we look at this story, from Schaefer, who sort of made it up, to Banting, who isolated it and discovered it, to later to Sanger, who said what it really was, that's how science moves. And I think this is right where we are today in diabetes and type 2 diabetes. And I think with a few more things here, I think we can converge some of these ideas together.
Yeah, I think it's brilliant actually, because insulin is such a fascinating molecule for 1,000 reasons. Not only for the fact that Schaefer first postulated that it may exist, and then it went on to actually be discovered and sequenced and beyond, but also because every mammal has a requirement for secreting insulin, and that mammals that don't secrete insulin, they die. Humans that don't secrete insulin, they die. But yet in the world of diabetes, somehow that message has been translated into insulin is bad for you, insulin is the enemy, don't inject insulin, avoid insulin at all costs. And it's kind of, it's right. a little.
Well, this is just like glucophobia as well. It's the same thing. Glucophobia, everybody thinks somehow, glucose, sugar. And that doesn't mean to go out and eat, candy bars. That's not, the problem is when you start using these very specific terms of biochemistry to mean generic swaths of food, they're not good food groups. And that's why I implore you and everyone listening, stop using protein, carbs, and fat as a food group. Use instead our food triangle, and let's talk about foods. Let's talk about a potato or an egg or whatever, because that way we're at least talking about something that makes sense. And some of these foods, like in my case, will cause me to not utilize insulin appropriately, and other ones actually made it better, because we just keep gaming the system. That's the problem.
Yes. Okay. So here's my next question for you. You speak a lot about the difference between managing biomarkers and then addressing the underlying metabolic dysfunction that may exist in the case of either type 1 diabetes or type 2 diabetes. So can you go into a little bit more detail about the difference between managing biomarkers and actually addressing underlying dysfunctions?
Yeah. And I'll tell you, I admire both of you guys for what you have to do as type 1s. I mean, and what you keep up with and how visceral that must be, because every day it's a reality. And I love to send Robbie's video to people, his YouTube video he has where he's doing his ratios. Well, hopefully we come back and talk about that. But here's what I mean. All the time I'll see on Facebook or Twitter or on some message somewhere, someone saying, hey, look, I cut out all of my carbs. I'm using it with quotes because I hate that word, but they cut out all the starchy foods, vegetables and fruits. And look at how great my fasting glucose is. Oh, look how great my hemoglobin A1C is. And I wear it as a badge of honor. And then I when I stop and I say, but wait, those biomarkers are there, and we use them and we test them as an indication of how your body is processing dietary starches and sugars. And to make this analogy maybe a little real, let's just assume that traffic tickets or citations and auto accidents are biomarkers for a bad driver, right? Well, you take the car away and you look at their driving record in 6 months and say, look, no tickets, no accidents. They're an amazing driver now. This is what people are doing with hemoglobin A1C and fasting glucose. And so why I think that's so important is because you guys can't take away the hypodermic pancreas. You've got to deal with that every day. So you guys really deal with this reality. But I think, out in general, people are using these markers to game the system. And if you just simply game the system, I don't know that means automatic health. That's not to say that there aren't some benefits of what people are doing, bringing in for their insulin levels down or bringing glucose levels down, et cetera. That's not the point. The point is that gaming the biomarkers is a great way. This is the ratio of HDL and LDL, my ratio is good, or, liver's full of nutrients. And so, it's also full of calories. So, when we look at the nutrient density, there's lots of nutrients. Yeah, but it's overnourishment. It's more than you need. So I can find lots of examples where we simply use a ratio or a biomarker or something like that, and we game the system. I believe when I talk about my type 2 diabetes is gone, that means I can eat potatoes, I can eat rice, I could even eat a Snickers bar if I wanted, and I wouldn't have 240s or 300 glucoses afterwards. That's what I mean. Not that I need to eat those things, not that I have to always eat high glycemic foods to prove that it's not there, but that if I do, I don't have a problem, just like before. That's what I feel like reversing it's about. It's about your body having normal physiological response to dietary carbohydrate.
That's a super, super important distinction, and I'm really glad you made that clear. Now, you have helped a lot of people lose weight. So how has weight loss impacted your clients' insulin resistance?
Well, it's interesting because I started out by saying weight loss didn't fix mine. So that's first thing. The second thing that's really amazing is that when people change their diet, these biomarkers meaning, and they're increasing, and most times they're increasing the glucose in their diet. They're increasing the starches and fruits in their diet. But what's interesting is that they actually get better biomarkers before the weight loss is gone. So, one of the things that I've come to sort of understand is it's true that adipose tissue is hormonally active. And there are things called the spillover effect and other things where fat can become maladaptive. Something we have that's an energy store that's good for us, but you accumulate too much and can become maladaptive. But the fact that so many people resume normal glucose response or dietary postprandial glucose response before they lose all their weights say that basically the fat itself isn't the single thing that we're dealing with. And so what that does for me, and I think the most significant part for us to talk about, today and for people to think about, is that diet's probably going to drive this particular dysfunction that we're talking about. And, and what I've listened to you guys tell me over and over about how you manage your blood glucose with your insulin, since you guys are type 1s, I think what it says is that, you got to start with diet first. You fix your diet, you get to the best you can, and then you start adjusting. And it seems like, that maybe a lead in, but it seems like that applies as much to people like me as people like you.
100%. So let's go on this topic here a little bit more, because like you've alluded to, I have type 1 diabetes. Robbie has type 1 diabetes. You used to have type 2 diabetes and you reversed that simply by changing your diet. Now, there's a lot of crossover. There's a lot of difference between type 1 or insulin dependent diabetes and then type 2 or non-insulin dependent diabetes. So they have different fundamental physiologies that lead to each one of those conditions, but yet there's also a lot of crossover. So let's go into a little bit detail about that. How do you?
Yes. So let's start back at the beginning. What are the symptoms of both of our conditions? Glucosuria, glucose in the urine, right? And high glucose in your blood after a meal that has dietary carbohydrate. 100 years ago, that's all it was. It was just symptoms. The difference is someone like yourself had what was called a severe onset, early onset. Normally it happened when you were young, and it was instant, and it resulted in wasting. And people like myself normally got this in their 40s. So it was sort of called, and that migrated to become at one time called adult onset. But now we're giving it to children because we're feeding them the same way. So the point is, this accumulation of dysfunction that happened for me over 45 years versus your guys who both suddenly had an issue, you aren't producing insulin. I'm producing insulin and my tissue isn't using it properly. So the idea is that I feel like when we look at this and we call it diabetes, and this, diabetes mellitus comes from that, the siphoning and, the sweetness of the honey, so this is a sweet urine. And, doctors were like, they were boss back then to be tasting people's urine. I mean, can you imagine? This is the early day of being a coach. Good coaches taste their patients' urine. I mean, it's like crazy to think about, but like that's really what they did. Not to bring this too funny, but I mean, seriously, this is really our history. This is our history of what we were doing.
Those are some dedicated doctors back in the day. Let me tell you that.
They were, man. They were all about it. So, so I just had to freeze my ass off. That was all I did for science. So, but anyway, and not eat. So, but anyway, so where I get with you guys is that, I guess the part that I want to sort of talk to you guys about, because you deal with this every day with people like me and people like you, is this idea that if mine is completely dietary induced and yours is a physiological issue of a pancreas, what keeps you from inducing the same problem I had with a diet?
Nothing. Absolutely nothing. And that's the beauty. Yeah.
But I think you guys should talk about that a little bit, because I think most people, that's actually not a simple concept. I don't think most people really understand what we just said.
Okay. So let's go into a little bit of detail about that. So So you're referring to the fact that people like Robbie and myself, we either have type 1 diabetes or type 1.5, which is still an autoimmune adult onset version of type 1 diabetes. We suffer from an autoimmune condition, which basically means that our immune system is attacking the insulin producing beta cells, which then leads to a reduction or a complete absence of insulin production from the inside. So we don't make any insulin anymore, which means that we got to give it to ourselves from the outside. That being said, what we see with a lot of people living with type 1 diabetes, and what Robbie and I personally experienced ourselves, is that as soon as you adopt a low carbohydrate diet, right? This is a diet that's got, a lot of animal products in it: meat, cheese, eggs, fish. By eating that way, you can end up inducing the symptoms of type 2 diabetes. So you're living with type 1, and then you eat yourself into insulin resistance. And as a result of that, now you have type 1 diabetes and the symptoms of type 2 diabetes, which is basically what's called double diabetes, right? So that's what you're hinting at here, which is that, there's nothing the only thing that's different about the two of us is that your pancreas works to make insulin and ours doesn't. But other than that, you could follow the exact same dietary pattern and end up with the exact same results.
Yeah. And so I think that's so important, because when I've, listened to Robbie talk about, things that you guys use to track, how effective your insulin is, and how, people who are living with this every day, I feel like it would be really easy to think that the easiest way to affect your insulin usage was just how often you were swallowing dietary carbohydrate. But it turns out it's not a simple one-to-one function. Just like I can go with 3 to 5 servings of salmon, I can give myself type 2 diabetes again. It's not that hard. It doesn't take much. I have sort of a predisposition for it, right? So there's part of that is sort of a genetic skew. But if I just start eating that same stuff I was eating before, it just comes right back. Now I can make it go away, but it comes back. So, Robbie, in terms of from your perspective, the idea that people maybe aren't thinking about the fact that it's not just a simple how much insulin versus how many carbs you've counted, right?
Yeah, for people living with type 1 diabetes, managing their blood glucose, you have to consider a lot of different factors. And so it's about your activity. How much are you moving? Your sleep, stress, for women, the menstrual cycle. So there's a lot of factors involved, and you got to pay attention to it. So it's very important. We teach people how to do that in our coaching program. But the underlying thing is that whether you're living with type 1, type 2, we teach people how to reverse insulin resistance. And that's exactly what you're talking about, what you did in your lifestyle, how you could reverse type 2 diabetes. So that's really the main thing we do here. And it applies to all forms of diabetes.
Yeah, it's really great. Once I finally made that connection, it just felt to me just sort of freeing to think about. I can't give you guys an oral glucose tolerance test. I can't just give you 75 grams of glucose to slug down to see how your body responds, because we know how it responds.
But luckily, for people living with type 1, we can't do an oral glucose tolerance test, but because we are always monitoring our blood glucose, we know the amount of insulin we're injecting, and we measure the carbohydrate. You have to. Every type 1, you have to have some knowledge of what's going in your body. So with those information, we actually can easily assess our insulin sensitivity, how much it's changing, how much it's improving on a day-by-day basis. So it's kind of a fun game in that regard.
Right. And so what sort of thing do you guys monitor? How do you do that?
So we have a tool actually that we call the decision tree. And the decision tree is basically designed to teach you as the user how your body responds to the food that you're eating and the exercise that you're performing, and your overall lifestyle habits. So let's say, an individual comes into our program and is living with type 1 diabetes like myself and Robbie. The decision tree is basically, it's nothing more than a fancy a log that basically says, tell me every single thing that you're doing. So, you write down what you had for breakfast, and you're very detailed in understanding its macronutrient composition, because that gives you information. Then you write down what happens to you 2 hours after that. How much insulin did you give yourself before? how much time did you wait, what happened to your blood glucose afterwards, and so on and so forth. So you repeat this process over and over and over again for breakfast and lunch and dinner today, for breakfast and lunch and dinner tomorrow, and so on and so forth. And then we teach you how to pattern match. And pattern match basically says, oh, if I consume this type of food, then I can expect this result. If I consume this type of food, then I can expect this result. And people start to recognize there's these epiphanies that go off in people's heads when they say, oh, wait a minute. If I just do this and I kind of follow the same pattern for breakfast, then I can expect that my blood glucose is going to do this. And as a result of that, they get insight into, what's happening to their glucose metabolism. And it also informs them of how they can modify their insulin use in that process. So the video that you were talking about earlier with Robbie, around on his bicycle and telling people exactly what he's doing on a daily basis to control his blood glucose is eye-opening, because it really gives you insight into the idea that, this puzzle doesn't have to be complicated, but as long as you walk into it having a basic idea of the cause and effect relationship between the food that you're eating and your blood glucose patterns, then as long as you sort of repeat a certain set of behaviors over and over again, and heaven forbid you actually enjoy doing that, then it can actually become a really straightforward process that enables you to keep your blood glucose under control and keep your insulin use nice and low.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. It's just been great, getting to know you guys and, and watching how this happens. And then for me, the idea that I've just completely separated, non-insulin dependent and insulin dependent diabetes is completely sort of unrelated conditions. I always, with both of you guys always joke, you have a hypodermic pancreas. And as Robbie says, you actually know exactly how much, you're dosing. So I don't know, I could be eating stuff and my body's, there's no continuous insulin monitor. If we had that, boy, it sure would change things. And I would also say to anybody watching is probably the most visceral idea I had, visceral change in my lifestyle came from 2 years of wearing a continuous glucose monitor. If you can get a prescription for one and wear one, I don't think there's a single device. In fact, I think if we just issued every type 2 when they got it, that alone would sort of could help people change. It'd be the best money spent, because it gives you a lot of things. You think, oh, I'm having low glucose, or I'm having high, or I'm sleepy now, and it's not what you think. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I'd look down at my monitor and everything was just fine, and I would have some symptom that before that I would have blamed on some glucose variation. And when you're sticking yourself in the finger, you just don't capture the same as that pattern or that path. I don't know if you found that too, Robbie.
Yeah, absolutely. The continuous glucose monitor is super insightful. And one of the doctors that we work with at our retreats, Dr. Gibson, he does that with a lot of his type 2 patients. He lets them use it for a few weeks, and the insights are very profound. There's no question about it.
So Ray, let me ask you this question. You've worked with a lot of people personally to try and help them lose weight, overcome diabetes, overcome other health, complicated sort of chronic diseases. In your experience, what is the number one challenge that you see that people face when it comes to lifestyle change? And then how do you help them overcome that particular issue?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's their social relationship with food. Until the new diet becomes equally convenient, familiar, and enjoyable, you don't have a choice. One of those 3 things will dominate your plate. And, if you're trying to moderate and control something, in terms of diet and not going all the way, and you're hanging out with people who socially that are eating the wrong thing, the chance that you're going to moderate and manage the social behavior are just sort of overwhelmingly in favor of failure. So what I try to tell people is, go all the way for some period of time. Don't make a decision about what you're going to eat for the rest of your life. It's irrelevant. You don't need to make that decision right now. This is what you're going to do. Eat to survive for a little bit. Eat to understand for a little bit. And what you'll find is, just like any habit, once you've been doing something for a while, you're simply get used to it. I mean, you two did not get a choice about whether or not you wanted to give yourself shots every day. but I don't think there's a single person other than someone that's habituated like you guys that would, the thought of giving themselves shots the other day, or the thought when you guys were in the first week or two, like, or a month or however long it takes. I can't imagine where you're thinking, oh my gosh, I have to do this every day. But I've been with you so many times where it's just, you know, boop, boop, you don't even look. You guys are just on it. And so everything we do about food is habit. It's all habit. What you prefer, what you like, what tastes, everything is habit. And so the only way you're going to succeed is to create some new habits that are equally convenient, familiar, and enjoyable. So that is the advice I would give everybody. You got to stick with it long enough until those things happen.
I think it's brilliant. I think it's super concise. And I mean, a lot of the speakers that we've been asking the same question to come up with very, very similar responses. You know, it's all up here. The whole thing is right up here. And as long as you can basically get to a point where you're mentally comfortable and emotionally comfortable eating a different set of food, the world is your oyster, your plant-based oyster at that point. Right. So,
and we have just, you know, just in the last week, we had our plant-based nutrition, the Idiot's Guide with Juliana Hever. We had that book hit the street. So it's the second edition. It's the one with the black cover. It's a step-by-step book to, you know, implement plant-based diet for people that are there. So people that want to look at it. And, you know, for a lot of people, they might not want to go, they might not go all the way at first. And I understand that. I'm going to suggest do it not because you've made some life commitment that you're, you know, just going to eat plants, but rather because I think halfway doesn't work, especially in this. It didn't work for me, other than gaming the systems. That's the only thing I got out of moderation was gaming the system. So in our guide, we talk about shopping, we talk about athletics, we talk about pregnancy and children. I mean, we cover the gamut. And then some of the other concepts that we've talked about before, even here: oxidative priority, metabolic winter hypothesis, longevity, health span, the food triangle. There's a lot of information in there. It's a step-by-step guide.
I love it. So give us an idea. How can people find that book? And, you know, is it on Amazon?
Yeah, Amazon, Barnes & Noble. It should be in bookstores in different places if you see it, or ask for it if you don't. But it's the Plant-Based Nutrition second edition, and it's the Idiot's Guide series.
Fantastic. Okay, so thanks so much for being here with us today, Ray. I always learn a ton when I'm talking to you, and you know, your insights and your experience are super valuable. So I hope our listeners got a lot out of this interview, and we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks, guys.